Prior to Ron DeSantis' botched announcement of his presidential campaign in May, he was almost unanimously hailed by the GOP as the heir apparent to the throne. However, despite raising ungodly sums of money since that time, his stock has only moved in one direction, downwards. And during the same period, we've seen the emergence of another candidate that has now overtaken DeSantis in the number of polls. How did this happen? DeSantis wasn't embroiled in a salacious scandal. His positions haven't materially changed, and his chief competitor is now facing dozens of criminal charges. The reason for Ron's precipitous collapse and Vivek's meteoric rise comes down to three important intangibles. The first is personality, or in Ron's case, lack thereof. As governor, DeSantis has proven to be an effective executive, but the presidency is a different beast. Being strong on policy is simply not enough. You need an authoritative presence that goes beyond just the X's and O's, and Ron is seriously lacking in two key areas where Vivek excels: charisma and conviction. No matter how competent a person is, in order to lead, it's imperative to wield the power of persuasion. You must be likable and possess the ability to inspire others. And the truth is, Ron is simply a very dry person. He's attempted to overcome this deficit through sheer brute force, but this has only turned more people off because it's obviously performative. And this is not a trivial shortcoming, because a big part of the president's job is to convince others to join your mission, whether it be the public, Congress, or foreign leaders. Vivek, on the other hand, exudes charisma. On paper, he shouldn't be in this race at all. He's young, a former big pharma exec, Indian, and a Hindu. But Vivek's popularity has skyrocketed in a very short span of time, because even his staunchest critics recognize that he's one of the most articulate and quick-witted politicians we've ever seen. He's able to go into any environment, even very hostile ones, and win people over. In some respects, Vivek is a combination of DeSantis' competence and Trump's flair. And much of this has to do with Vivek's deep-seated sense of conviction. This is a guy who, as a 20-year-old, wrote an article while at Deep Blue Harvard, arguing against raising the minimum wage of janitors because of his unwavering belief in meritocracy. And then 15 years later, he would step down as CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company because he refused to bend the knee to BLM or to remain silent in the face of the political ills he saw plaguing society. Further, on the campaign trail, Vivek has taken clear, decisive positions on a number of controversial topics, such as the Ukraine war, abortion, raising the voting age, climate change, and birthright citizenship. When a candidate explicitly states his policies like this in great detail, there's a much higher probability that he'll do everything in his power to effectuate his plans, especially if he wants to win re-election. But Ron hasn't given us the same level of clarity because, if you've noticed, he rarely gives direct answers to questions. Take this statement on the Ukraine war as one example.
A lot of people say you're a little slippery on Ukraine.
I don't think so. I mean, what happened was, I said, it's something that, no blank check. It's not a vital interest where we'd have ground troops under any circumstance. It's a secondary or tertiary interest, and the goal should be to bring it to a conclusion so that we don't have wars breaking out in Europe or we don't have this going on for 50 years. And that's pretty much what I've been. People said, oh, he said Vladimir Putin's a bad guy, so that must be a change because wouldn't he, if Putin's bad, don't you have to support a never-ending blank check? No, there's a different question between Putin being a bad guy, which he is, Russia being the aggressor, which they are, but then our national interests and the risks of us getting enmeshed in this. I'm the only guy running that's actually put on the uniform. I was in Iraq at a time where, things weren't great in places like Fallujah and Ramadi, and I'm very conscious and sensitive to doing things where there's not a clear mission, where we don't know what exactly we're trying to accomplish. Biden is still not articulated. He just says as long as it takes. So as president, my goal would be to end it, not to escalate it. I think we can do that, but you're going to have to use other levers that Biden has not been willing to do. For example, on the energy. He is basically funding both sides of the conflict.
Correct.
Our energy policy helps Russia. helps Iran. He gave $6 billion to Iran just now. Iran is helping Russia in the conflict. China is helping Russia in the conflict. And then people will sometimes say, well, because it's borderland between Russia and Ukraine, like why should America care? And so what the DC people will say is, well, China is watching this. They're going to see, and that may cause them what they do with Taiwan. I actually think what China wants, they want to see a long, protracted quagmire because we're running low on ammunition in the West. Stockpiles are diminishing.
Agree.
Russia, if they're in it, Russia will get weakened too. But China wants a weak Russia because that means Russia's a client state of China. Because China and Russia, they get along, but then they don't, or whatever. This China would be, or Russia would be dependent on China in that situation. So I think it's in our interest for this to come to an end as expeditiously as possible.
Ron hits all of the superficial conservative talking points, saying that he doesn't want to give a blank check or to escalate the war, and he wants to end it as soon as possible. But if you ask any of the warmongers, from the Mike Pences to the Nikki Haley's, they'd likely articulate the exact same empty niceties. What Ron omits is whether he would definitively stop funding Ukraine, which only one GOP candidate has had the spine to fearlessly state. Being strategically ambiguous in this way allows politicians to avoid offending one side or the other, and it affords them the wiggle room to slither in one direction or another, depending on which ways the prevailing winds are blowing. But that's not how a true leader operates. He doesn't just float around in the ether depending on what political consultants or polls say. A true leader forms his own beliefs and principles based on his knowledge and experiences, and then he convinces others to follow along through the art of persuasion. The second intangible where Vivek has the advantage is that he's not a politician. His stellar resume has been built entirely in the private sector. On the other hand, outside of a short 2-year stint, Ron has worked for the government his entire career, starting out as an attorney for the Navy and the Middle District of Florida, then moving on to the House of Representatives, and finally to the governorship in Florida. But if you've ever dealt with the government before, you know that it is, by and large, painfully inefficient, whether it be the DMV, or the post office, or getting a permit to do some work on your house. These inefficiencies are structurally built into how our government operates. In most institutions, the bar to be terminated as a government employee is very high, and because governments are nonprofit, the incentives for an employee to excel and overachieve are very low. This means that the government tends to not attract our best and brightest, and for those in the system, there isn't a whole lot of intrinsic motivation to maximize their potential. Take the two most prominent positions from DeSantis' resume as an example: congressman and governor. Being elected to the House is, in effect, a 2-year non-terminable contract. And the way you renew this contract, in reality, isn't by actually doing anything of substance. In the modern age, it's about getting TV spots and owning people on social media. You are just one of 535 legislators. So when a congressman participates in passing a bill, in almost all instances, he doesn't actually read what the bill says in its entirety. Typically, a congressman pushes for his pet projects to be included or to prevent the inclusion of others. They don't have total ownership over what is ultimately passed by both houses. This is why many laws include random pork. On the other hand, if you're the CEO of a private company, all roads of accountability lead to you. If you're asleep at the wheel and don't have a tight grip on the company's purse strings and initiatives, the enterprise will inevitably fail. And although DeSantis was, by many measures, an effective governor, the bar is actually not very high for that position either. One inherent flaw with any governmental role, and this is especially true for governors, is that they mostly operate through fiat. They wield extraordinary powers that they did not cultivate themselves. That power is a function of our governmental system. Officials are just elected or appointed to fill a seat in the machine. So in order for a governor to be effective, for the most part, they just need to be able to prioritize important policies and have a minimal level of competence to execute them. However, being an effective president requires a lot more. The bulk of the challenges a president faces aren't from subjects that he has dominion and control over. They are from the co-equal branches of the government, the Congress and the judiciary, and from independent third parties, foreign nations. So although DeSantis has proven himself as an effective administrator, that alone doesn't tell us whether he possesses the full set of skills that will be required to be an effective commander-in-chief of the United States on the world stage. On the other hand, in order to be a successful founder of a private company, you don't inherit power, you must build an enterprise from scratch. And as CEO, you must have the ability to skillfully navigate relationships with countless independent third parties at arm's length. Take Vivek, for example. As founder and CEO of a multi-billion-dollar biotech business, he had to convince sophisticated investors to risk hundreds of millions of dollars to support his mission. He then had to hire and manage a strong team of executives, doctors, and others to help implement that mission. He had to negotiate with gigantic pharma companies to acquire drugs from, and then after development, to sell the drugs to. And in order to develop the drugs, he had to traverse the complex world of regulatory agencies such as the FDA. To thrive in this sort of unforgiving environment, having formidable negotiation skills is mandatory. You need to be simultaneously cutthroat, delicate, aggressive, and nuanced. And you need to be able to identify incentives and know how to leverage your resources to gain thin edges. So although it is true that Vivek has no experience as a politician, he's demonstrated over his successful career that he possesses critical executive skills that will be an invaluable asset as president, and he has a caliber of aptitude that we rarely see in the political arena. The third and final intangible is vision. Both Vivek and Ron are two of the most well-known critics of woke ideology. Vivek wrote a book on it in 2021, and DeSantis implemented a number of anti-woke policies during his tenure as governor. However, while identifying these sorts of cultural cancers and fighting back against them are both important, they're not sufficient. If the goal is to heal and unify our divided country, as it should be, something more is required. The problem with waging a cultural war against these ideologies is that they stem from a hyper-manifestation of immutable traits, whether it be race, gender, or sexual orientation. So when conservatives attack these manifestations, those on the left perceive this as an attack on characteristics that are inextricably tied to who a person is. A minority can't just cease being a minority, and a woman can't just cease being a woman. Ultimately, this means that when conservatives deride wokeness, although they may win some battles and increase their influence, at the end of the day, it drives a certain segment of the population and their allies to just further retreat and become more entrenched in their own isolated silos. This civil war can't be won by simply defeating the enemy, because the opposition will never be eliminated or relinquish who they are. Vivek is the only presidential candidate that has had the foresight to see that this path will lead to societal collapse and has therefore offered an elegant solution. Instead of focusing on repeatedly bashing one side over the head, as a centerpiece of his campaign, he's offered an alternative vision to revive the founding ideals of our nation, which are compatible with the unique, diverse identities of the American people: meritocracy, hard work, patriotism, faith, family. An individual can adopt these ideals while at the same time remain proud of their ethnic heritage or their gender or sexual orientation. If the complete identities of citizens are filled with shared values, it will dilute the current obsession with immutable traits and provide us with common bonds that can bring us closer together. So although Ron DeSantis has proven himself as a competent governor, the presidency requires something more than just raw competency. And unfortunately for Ron, he simply lacks certain intangibles that Vivek possesses in spades. It's therefore high time for DeSantis supporters to wake up and see the writing on the wall. He can't just magically grow these intangibles to turn his campaign around because they're innate. You either have them or you don't. So we need to be honest and recognize that DeSantis simply is not the best man for the job, and instead, it's in the best interests of our union to join the cause of a candidate that possesses both competence as well as these essential innate qualities that can lead America back to its status as the greatest nation in the world.